Hello. Sorry to interrupt your lunch in advance. We apologize. My name is David Dayen. I am the executive editor of the American Prospect. I want to thank Hal and Chris. It's been a great conference so far. And I'm going to break some news here. In just a few weeks, there's an election happening. And so we're going to talk about that in the context of the issues that have come up so far in this conference. With me here is Helaine Olen. She is the managing editor of the American Economic Liberties Project. She writes at MSNBC, and she's written for the American Prospect recently, and a whole host of other organizations, author of a couple consumer finance books, Pound Foolish and The Index Card with Carol Pollack. So thank you for being here, Helaine. And let's kick this off. I think one thing that's very interesting to me, and it kind of hit home the other day when Attorney General Merrick Garland came out and he announced a $3 billion fine for TD Bank for money laundering with Mexican drug cartels. And it's very possible that's the first time you've heard that. And it was not front page news exactly. And it's just interesting to me, the shift wasn't so long ago, 2016. Financial regulation was a huge part of the election. It was a huge part of the primary between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And it was a part of the presidential election. And now we've seen this shift. And it kind of mirrors a shift in campaign finance from Wall Street being the locus of power to Silicon Valley. What do you think about that shift?
Hey there, it's great to be here. And before I start talking, I should say, because we are talking the election, I am obliged to remind everybody of my Twitter or X bio, whatever you call it these days, which is I'm a woman of many opinions, all my own. In other words, American economic liberties might not share some of these opinions. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself, everybody. Anyway, great question. And it really is a twofold answer. The first part is, I always say that real social change happens when you forget how things were different very recently. And I think this is a perfect example of it. We were obsessed with the banks, we were obsessed with the banks, we were obsessed with the banks, and then one day we were obsessed with tech. And we totally forgot that we were obsessed with the banks. And the reason we forgot we were obsessed with the banks, in part, is because tech, which had slowly been taking over our lives over this period from, say, the mid-1990s onward. I mean, I always tell people I was in the last generation of people in newsrooms before the internet. And when I had to actually write for word count. And the, tech has just become more and more a part of our lives, right? This phone thing, which barely didn't exist, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, the iPhone, is suddenly now, who could live without a phone in your pocket? It's basically a mini computer in your pocket, right? And so this has become a huge part of our lives. And as it's become a huge part of our lives, in part because tech was seen as the good guys for a long time, that was going to save us from the predations of Wall Street. It was going to, bring on this wonderful new world. It wasn't regulated the way we think of regulating the banks, right? And this is slowly, finally beginning to change. But at the same time, of course, to give this a second part of the question, this doesn't mean the banks are less important in their own way. They're still extremely important. If you're investing in a 401k, trust me, if anything goes wrong, you will think that Wall Street is very important. And, in some ways, they're just getting ignored in all of this, per David's comment. It's not like these fines aren't happening. It's not like regulatory efforts aren't happening. It's not like they're fighting regulatory efforts. But there's only so much attention. Attention is a pie, and you can only cut it so many ways. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you ask the other question, is speaking of, we had Rohit Chopra here earlier, director of the CFPB. And one of the things I noticed is, over the first half of Biden's term in office, the enemy, so to speak, for the big interests, for the big lobbyists, was Rohit Chopra, actually. And the Wall Street Journal edit page was absolutely obsessed with Rohit Chopra. And then at some point, it sort of switched over as the FTC started looking more and more at, and the justice started looking at more and more at big tech, suddenly became lead a con.
I asked Rohit if he was jealous. Don't you want, CEOs to call for your head too? So yeah, I mean, that I think exemplifies this shift, right? From Wall Street to Silicon Valley. And often you see these kinds of regulations, this kind of regulatory environment happen on a pendulum. There's a big crisis. We got to scramble to set up a regulatory system to deal with that last crisis. And then we kind of forget about it and we swing in the other direction. Things get a little more permissive. And then a crisis happens and we swing back. One of the ways that we can think about this is kind of the industry that's sort of situated in between Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and that would be cryptocurrency, right? And they are spending massive amounts of money in this election. The number one industry in terms of campaign spending, I think something like over $100 million, and has done so in a way that has really influenced the kind of regulatory environment that I think we're going to see for them, and how Congress in particular is reacting to try to weaken the regulatory strictures there. What do you think about cryptocurrency's involvement in this election?
My take on cryptocurrency is not kind. This has become huge. They've spent an estimated, I think it's the last number I saw a couple of days ago was 119 million. And we still have several weeks to go here. This is one of my sort of hobby horses to get up on is, talking about campaign finance reform and how much this underlies so many of the problems we face in this country, and, so many of the predations that are done to people and consumers in this country, right? And in some ways, what's going on with cryptocurrency exemplifies this. It sort of is the middleman here right now between Wall Street here, Silicon Valley here. And one of the things that has been going on is that Wall Street would very much like to be able to get people to invest in cryptocurrency more, and they've been lobbying for that. One reason some of the tech people are sort of sticking their noses into the election in various ways, either, saying they favor Trump or Harris, seems to be related to cryptocurrency holdings and what they want done. And so there's this sort of idea that, and they've thrown a lot of money behind this, that there's a cryptocurrency voter. Spoiler, there is no cryptocurrency voter. Or I take that back. There are a few, there might be as many as can fit into this room. I mean, of course, there's always one, right? And the polls show the vast majority of people think cryptocurrency is useless, that it shouldn't exist, that they don't like it, they don't want it, fill in the blank, right? You could go over and over this. And nonetheless, this has somehow become this huge talking point in our election, with both, Trump and Harris saying that they will, work to regulate it in various ways. Again, in my view, this is, full on, showing the power of money in our politics, basically. One of the reasons the crypto people, particularly and some of the Silicon Valley people and Wall Street people, have been so angry at the Biden administration is because the SEC under Gary Gensler had been attempting to punish, for lack of a better word here, the cryptocurrency people for basically engaging in selling unregulated securities. A take that I would totally agree with. This is an investment. If it's pitched as an investment vehicle, it's an investment vehicle. And the crypto people are not happy about this. The crypto stuff kind of exists in this weird space in American culture where, somehow we are told that, some libertarian, the problem to solve government inefficiencies isn't to figure out how to regulate it better or do something about campaign finance reform. It's that government shouldn't exist in any meaningful way. And this is what cryptocurrency really plays to.
I think you see the fact that there are only enough cryptocurrency voters to fit in this room by virtue of the fact that I think 99.9% of all crypto spending in this election doesn't mention crypto.
Mhm.
They are ads that are, targeted at or in favor of people who may have opinions on crypto, but they don't mention crypto at all. And so I think that's a key thing to understand, that this is about the power of money, not the power of a particular issue.
Mhm.
So, so we're going to talk about, what we might expect from the two major party candidates, and if they were to win, in terms of these issues of consumer protection and antitrust. Obviously, a lot of that is dependent on what happens in Congress, and there are strong indications that Republicans probably have an edge in the Senate. I'm not breaking news here either, and Democrats may have a chance to capture the House, but there is likely divided government happening. So a lot of the action is going to be in the agencies, and obviously we have agency officials here. The question that, as you alluded to, that has kind of dominated this whole space is, a consumer protection issue, but also an antitrust issue, and that is, will Lina Khan be retained at the Federal Trade Commission? She needs not be reconfirmed for anything. She can continue to serve as long as she wants, until such time as there's a replacement that is confirmed by the Senate. So just through inertia, she would be able to continue to serve. What do you think of the dynamics that have gone on? You've seen a lot of Harris backers who are rich and being investigated by the FTC, I should mention, saying that maybe she shouldn't be retained. What do you think about that?
Okay, first, anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen with this is lying to you. They don't know, okay? Because if they know, they're not talking. I usually talk about this with money and how to invest, not with this issue, but okay. But second, I mean, this is a really good demonstration of some of the forces going on. As as soon as Harris, was basically the presumptive candidate, you started to see these very wealthy people. I'm thinking particularly of Reid Hoffman, of Barry Diller, coming out, Mark Cuban saying, Lina Khan is terrible and she has to go. And, it was, and it sort of came out of, if you're a member of the public, this came out of nowhere. Like, who is this person? Why are they ranting about her all the time? Of which I could say, watch CNBC more often, though I don't really want to tell anybody to do that. And she has just been their enemy. And as it's turned out, there's massive conflict of interest going on in this recommendation to telling Harris to get rid of her, which is, Reid Hoffman's invested in various and sundry companies, including AI stuff that's under investigation by FTC or DOJ. Mark Cuban is very involved with crypto. Barry Diller, it turned out, one of his companies, I think it was Care.com, which turned out to be under FTC investigation as well. None of this was said when they went on TV and started screaming that she had to go. But the issue becomes, what is going to be, where will this all end up? And of course, no one really knows. But one of the things that's particularly telling is that you're starting to see this kind of groundswell of support, of swing state Democrats wanting to campaign with Lina Khan. The fact is that what she is doing, even though I would say most people don't know who she is extremely popular. The vast majority of Americans think corporations have too much power, that rich people have too much power, and that something needs to be done about this. And that, so anybody who is doing this is quite popular. And I would say that one of the issues, and we've sort of had this strangely policy-free campaign, for lack of a better word. And a lot of the reasons we've had this policy-free campaign is because, of course, Trump doesn't really talk about policy. So, if you're running against him on a basic level, why would you, right? I mean, so it makes sense that it has not been policy-oriented focused, because Trump is, you're either for him or against him at this point. But the issue with that ultimately is should Harris win the election, is right now she has sort of come across as all things to all people. in a lot of ways. And you can't govern as all things to all people. So what happens when you get to the White House? Unless you're very, very careful, somebody's going to feel very betrayed very quickly. And I think the Lina Khan saga has kind of come in its own way to sort of exemplify that.
I think what's interesting to me about this is that you're right that there's been, sort of policy-free zones throughout this campaign, but it lurks in the background. And whenever Harris comes out and talks about any part of the Biden-Harris record, it's inevitably things that either Lina Khan or our previous speaker, Rohit Chopra, did. It's things like taking medical debt off of credit reports, which she, in her very first speech as a presidential candidate, mentioned. Or getting the price of inhalers down to $35 by stopping patent abuse. Or, the actions being taken against companies like RealPage for algorithmic price fixing. Or the federal price gouging law that she has discussed in terms of groceries, but which got a lot of pushback from economists about, do we need a federal price gouging law? Is the cure worse than the disease, kind of thing? I think some of this speaks to Harris's history as a law enforcer. So she was, as Attorney General of California, someone who dealt with a lot of these similar issues. Our AGs are on the front lines of the kinds of things that we're hearing about in this conference. So what do you think that background, how does that inform how she might take a look at these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I would say there's been one other area also, which has been, especially in the post-Dobbs world, abortion. And that has been, a huge, huge issue. This is a good question. And, I think on some levels, these are issues that I always say there's always this weird dichotomy with consumer law, for lack of a better word here for a minute, where it's incredibly important to people. We live in a consumer republic, right? And in a lot of ways, I've come to feel over the years of reporting on this that people will have a bad interaction with a company, be it RealPage, be it their credit card company, be it robocalls, et cetera, and they'll get angry at the government. Right? Like we have this thing where it's like we blame the government, and in a way we should, because it's often a lack of regulation or inadequate regulation, right? But it sort of speaks to our focus as consumers. And at the same time, and if it doesn't work, we feel betrayed, right? The government's not working for us. At the same time, political coverage is very different in a lot of ways. And what's important to political reporters is very different. And you very rarely see a focus in on these issues that are often the thing that matters most to people. It'll be very horse race dominated. It will be very character dominated. And so you just see when a lot of politicians come up, and they come up as people who, these are just secondary issues too, for lack of a better word. And, Kamala Harris, it never was, with the exception of the mortgage crisis, I would say, and you could talk about her role in this much more than I can, and you probably should for a minute, is that he's done a lot of work on this, is that it wasn't her focus. So, of course, this was not what was huge in the California Senate race in 2018, sorry. She came up.
It was 16.
It was 16, thank you. She came up, through, the crime, law and order world of San Francisco, late 90s, early 2000s. And so it's just never been her primary focus. And I think you can still see that to this day. That being said, I want to backtrack for 1 second here and point out she's said enough that we're talking about her a lot, right? We're not talking about Donald Trump. And Donald Trump.
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. But the point is nobody asks Donald Trump these questions. And part of that is, of course, he's been in office before. We have a general sense of where he's been. And I know Dave's going to ask me about that. But it's also because, he just won't answer them, or he'll lie, right? So we've just sort of defined our expectations down for him. And for a Democrat, we're expecting much, much more.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. Yeah, I wrote a book in 2016 about the foreclosure crisis and the mortgage crisis, where then AG Harris makes an appearance. I'm from California. I've been a constituent of hers nonstop since 2010, actually. Harris as AG experienced. She involved herself in a lot of multi-state investigations. It's hard to say where she actually took the lead. One of the places she did take the lead was in the shutting down of Corinthian colleges, which is a for-profit college network that was scamming students. It was, basically giving worthless diplomas to them and maximizing the amount of debt they could take out. She played a pretty prominent role there. She played a kind of a background role in a lot of these other multi-state investigations. She touts her work in the national mortgage settlement. She calls it, I took on predatory lending. That's actually not what it was about. It was about foreclosure abuse. But she talks about that a lot on the campaign trail, that she took on the big banks. I have a lot to say about that, but maybe we should move on to another topic. It's a little bit less than meets the eye. But in the campaign, one thing I do think is interesting, and then we'll get to Trump, is her focus. She talks very clearly in terms of, I'm going to take on bad actors, that there are, corporations that are working hard and playing by the rules, and I am just going to hold accountable those bad actors. And it's the question of where you draw the line there and how that line is drawn that I think is, the middle ground that's interesting here.
Right. I mean, I think I could fairly say that there is some concern among certain segments that when she says bad actors, she's talking about price gouging in the way we normally think about price gouging. There's a hurricane and somebody comes in and jacks up the prices on United Airlines, say, or something. But, what she thinks of, Uber taking advantage of their workers, of surveillance pricing, of the, the increased power of the big tech dominated, big tech dominated world is something of a mystery.
So you're saying she's kind of exploiting there's kind of two ways the term price gouging gets used.
Right.
One is in an emergency, in a hurricane. She put a very strong statement out this week about price gouging in the wake of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. And it's in a crisis that because of supply crunches, because of increased demand for lumber or fuel, that companies will jack up their prices. That's one term. And then the other term is kind of how normal people use it, which is, you're ripping me off. Mm-hmm. And she kind of plays in the dead space in between those two things.
Right. And this is where our campaign with, yes, there's policy, but maybe not as much as usual, has sort of really kind of, sort of not shed light on what is arguably some of the most important issues to Americans. And again, I will point out, nobody is asking these questions of Donald Trump either. I mean, this is because, nobody's asking him, well, what are you exactly going to do? What are your plans?
Right.
Well,
let's ask these questions.
Okay.
I mentioned that Kamala Harris took on a for-profit college. Donald Trump had a for-profit college called Trump University.
A fake one. Let's be really clear.
That was fined $25 million by the New York Attorney General in 2016. I think we can talk about what the first term looked like. They replaced Richard Cordray, who was director of the Consumer Financial Bureau, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with Mick Mulvaney, who was doing double duty as the head of the Office of Management and Budget and CFPB director at the same time. And what did that look like? What did consumer protection look like in the first term of Trump?
What consumer protection? There was, Trump basically, campaigned on this sort of combination of, I'm your friend and, actually cozying up to a lot of big business interests. Unless that is, they made him angry. So like one of the big antitrust things he did was, the AT&T stuff, which Time Warner. And, this was because he had gotten angry at them. And, this
He was angry at CNN.
CNN, thank you.
For
Yeah.
giving fake news.
Right.
And so Time Warner, which CNN was a part of, trying to merge with AT&T. And so he decided to, challenge that merger.
Right. But otherwise, I mean, this was all very clear very early in. He, when the CFPB, when he came in, they immediately overturned a huge pile of regulations. It was like at least 3 dozen. I think it was over 50 or 60, I'm forgetting, through the Congressional Review Act. A number of which were very consumer friendly, including the arbitration, which was discussed earlier at the CFPB. There was a rollback of various regulations in progress. There had been legislation telling the DOT to deal with the family seating issue. That is when, parents are separated from their kids and have to pay extra to sit with their children. And of course, that never happened under Trump. That just vanished into thin air. And there was a whole host of this stuff over and over again, where they just, they allowed junk fees to go through. He put Mulvaney, who spent a better part of his career trying to take apart the CFPB, in charge of the CFPB. Mick Mulvaney's, one of his first moves, mercifully unsuccessfully, was an attempt to try to shut down the public database at the CFPB.
Right, the consumer.
Where people write in their complaints and you can go online and see, what's the problem with, my bank's credit card, and see what people think. And he, I think he referred to it as Yelp for financial services or something. Am I remembering this right?
Yeah, I think
so, Trump just did, the few things he did were way, way, way outweighed by the really harmful stuff. I mean, one thing he did do, and it's interesting to me that this has not come up in the campaign at all, is he did, laws about hospital price transparency went through under him. And those laws have been roundly ignored by the hospitals. And and this, by the way, this demonstrates ultimately his bad faith, because he could easily bring this up if he wanted to, right? He could bring it up in a speech. He could bring it up, if he ever does a debate again, which I doubt, he could bring up the fact that this has just not been, this is something he did and no one's paying attention to it because it's not being enforced and it's not being mentioned by him or anybody else.
The thing I remember with consumer protection, particularly CFPB consumer protection in the Trump years, was something that I actually coined the phrase, the Mulvaney discount. And what that meant was there were a handful, when Mulvaney first got in, he paused enforcement on pretty much everything. And then he started trickling out these civil settlements on cases that started under Richard Cordray. And every one of them, he settled for far less than what was initially handed down. It was explicitly a reduction of fine. And he would even say in the settlement, we have reduced this fine. So it became the Mulvaney discount that happened over and over again during that term in office. The one thing that we could actually look at, and this is more on the antitrust side, is the ways in which the Trump's FTC and DOJ antitrust division went after big tech. The Google case that was just got a verdict in August, finding Google a monopoly in search for using various tactics to get exclusive presence on browsers and mobile phones by basically paying off the mobile phone companies or the browsers. That was started by Trump. That was actually initiated in 2020. And there are other cases like that. That seems to be a strange bedfellows area of this whole thing, the tech industry in particular, and tech antitrust. Would you expect that to continue?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Because it did exist, but with Trump, you always had the vague suspicion it existed because he was very angry about fake news. And,
Yeah, they're coming at it from a different.
They're coming at it from a different vantage point.
Yeah.
Now, J.D. Vance, his vice presidential running mate, has said Lena Khan is among his favorite member of the Biden cabinet. But, vice presidents traditionally have zero power. So, what that means for Trump is a great unknown. Nobody has really asked, again, nobody's asked him about it because the idea of asking Trump about policy is bonkers. But the result is we're dealing with this vast information vacuum. But yeah, he did do some stuff. And I would say one of the things about the antitrust movement as a whole is that it just sort of picked up steam over the past decade and sort of got, more and more came together more and more with each passing year. So you began to see actions by the, 2019, 2020 in ways that you just hadn't seen them, for decades earlier, be it under Democratic or Republican presidents.
And there are multi-state, both investigations and indictments and actual cases where there are blue state governor AGs and red state AGs on these same policies.
Ticketmaster.
Ticketmaster for one, which so some of those things you would expect to continue on. The question is whether they get settled. So like the Google case is a perfect example.
Right.
So we are at the stage where the verdict has come down, but there's a remedy phase that has to go through. And in that remedy phase, it's clearly going to be decided by a new presidential administration. Whether it's Harris or Trump, they're going to get a chance to sort of put their imprint on that in terms of whether they allow the case to continue and let the judge make a remedy verdict, or whether they try to settle the case, which certainly could happen. And this is actually very much like the Microsoft situation in the 2000s. So the Clinton administration got a verdict in the Microsoft case. Before the remedy phase was done, the Bush administration came in and did kind of a sweetheart settlement with Microsoft. And so even cases that have been initiated and almost completed in the Biden administration, the next administration is going to get an opportunity to deal with.
Right. And we don't really have, a good sense of how either Trump or Harris would deal with this, to be really clear.
I think the fact that Lena Khan is so front and center on all this means that all of the other players in this have gone unremarked upon, and maybe because there's a school of thought that because these Harris backers have come after Khan, that in a Harris administration it would be very difficult to get rid of her because it would look like the ultimate quid pro quo kind of situation. But everyone else who's sort of laying in the weeds, everyone else that isn't being talked about, that may be where, those kind of debts could be repaid to the big businesses.
I agree. I think Lena Khan has come to, as I said earlier, it's come to stand for the way Rohit Chopra did earlier in the term, sort of everybody, all of this, right? When they criticize her, in fact, it's funny. You could run a count on, CNBC or Bloomberg when criticisms of Lena Khan come up, and like sometimes it's, well, actually, no, DOJ did that, or actually, no, that's the CFPB.
Right.
These just old guys are on there ranting about Lena Khan at the moment. So that is, I think, a very good scenario. That's quite possible.
I wonder why the woman who is a young woman of color. Okay. Well, we are about out of time. I want to thank Helaine Olen with the American Economic Liberties Project. I'm David Dayen with the American Prospect, and thank you for listening, and we'll have a great rest of your conference. Hal, do you want to say something?
Thank you again. And something very quickly is that we have 2 more panels to go, and the reward for hanging in is I will disclose the location of the cocktail hour at the end of the last panel. So hang in there if you want to come. Thanks.